This is a Momentum Media production.
The SMSF Advisor Show. Your expert insights into the biggest themes shaping the SMSF advice industry.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the SMSF Advisor Show. I'm Miranda Brownlee, and I'm joined by my co-host Aaron Dunn. Hi Aaron.
Hi Miranda, how are you?
I'm good, and yourself?
Not too bad. Melbourne Cup week, of course, here in Melbourne. And Melbourne's put on a wonderful week of atrocious weather.
Yes, it's probably typical kind of Melbourne weather, I guess.
Yeah, it is. It is for spring, no doubt.
Yeah. So, just moving to some of the news that's happened in the last week or so. So, one of the things that we've just had passed last week was the Commonwealth Seniors Healthcare Card threshold changes, which may mean that there'll be more people that are able to be eligible now, and that some people with those grandfathered pensions might be, who want to commute their pension and roll over to a new one, might be able to do so, whereas that might have been a barrier for them previously.
Yeah, so this is good news, and I think the Services Australia website has commented on this for some time, but they've been hamstrung, of course, by the legislation having been finalised. So what this does is that it increases the income test for individuals if they're a single from about $61,000 up to $90,000, and for couples from around $94,000 up to $144,000. So what this does is it brings a fairly big cohort, I would have thought, of self-funded retirees that weren't previously getting the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card to now fall in and be eligible. And if any of the advisors out there that are listening have had discussions around the value of that Commonwealth Seniors Health Card, when we think about the benefits that you can get with scripts and other discounts, concessions on services, the last thing you ever wanted to do was to have that client lose that. And you touched on one of those topics, Miranda, was around the grandfathered pensions. So pensions that were predated to the 1st of January 2015, they actually weren't caught in the test, that income test, because of the legislation at that time. So, and as you've rightly also mentioned before, there may not have been any inference to want to make that change to that income stream, whereas now, based upon the fact that if they did restructure that income stream, yes, it might get included, but the increase in the threshold means that it has little or no bearing on them continuing to receive that card. So I think that the main thing for advisors is to really go back and identify clients that maybe previously weren't entitled to that card, where from the 20th of September this year, they're now going to be eligible.
Yeah, and we also had another rate hike this week, another 25 basis points. So it's now up to 2.85%, the cash target.
Yeah, so again, this from an SMSF perspective is naturally going to have a flow-on effect for limited recourse borrowing arrangements. So again, that gap between the related party LRBA rate and what the lenders, the financial institutions are looking at. So in a related party sense, 5.35% was that rate that got locked in May, using that May 2023 RBA indicator rate for investors, whereas now we're probably seeing LRBA loans through most of the providers in the marketplace, if not at 7, nudging 7, and potentially some going well higher than that over the next 12 months as well. So we're starting to see a really big gap between that related party loan figure and what the banks are obviously providing to the marketplace more generally as well.
Yeah. And we've also had inflation figures come through for the September quarter, which perhaps kind of means there's an increased likelihood that we could even see a $1.9 million general transfer balance cap if this continues into that December quarter as well.
Yeah, so this will be quite interesting, and we'll talk about it shortly with our budget wrap as well. But yeah, we already know in essence that we're, based upon the way that inflation has gone, that we will go from $1.7 to $1.8 million. It's hard to fathom that we may actually skip 2 lots in a particular financial year where that cap will go from 1.7 to $1.9 million. And we'll find out that towards the end of January, early February, roughly, when that December quarter is released, because that becomes the drop dead date in essence, where that figure, we had that confirmation of that figure to then apply for July the following year. But there is always that little one thing that stands between that, and that is the May 2023 budget, which, again, whether we see the government sort of pull the trigger on any freeze, we'll need to wait and see.
Yeah. And with some of these, I guess, challenges going on with the economy and things looking a bit more uncertain, the ATO has also flagged some concerns with SMSFs that also have their own small business, perhaps being tempted to illegally access funds out of their SMSF. And they've already seen sort of a bit of activity with that happening already. So it's obviously a big concern for them at the moment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the data that we're seeing come out of the ATO at the moment in terms of revenue shortfall and stuff does fall into that small business area. And the Assistant Commissioner, Justin McHale, did make some comment recently around the concerns that they have in this area, and therefore the ATO's programs are going to naturally put a focus on some of these, just to make sure that if there are any type of withdrawals or some type of financing and stuff, that it naturally falls within the confines of the superannuation laws and not simply just taking money out because there were financial constraints or issues in respect to that business or individuals that are involved in that business. So it is going to be a fairly challenging time coming up, as, like we've said, we've seen these rates continue to climb, and that's putting significant pressure on individuals and businesses ordinarily. And those that run SMSFs, it might seem like a very opportune way to get access to some cash flow, but there are ways and means in which you may be able to utilise super. But again, getting that documentation correctly, whether it's through an in-house asset arrangement or some other sort of compassionate ground relief, it is there, but the ATO is certainly going to be on top of the way in which those individuals might be looking to access superannuation.
Yes, and they've also seen just over the 2021-22 year a bit of an increase in reported contraventions. They didn't sort of think that was a big concern, and that it might just be because there's been that big changeover in auditors due to the change in auditor independence requirements.
Yeah, and I think we touched on this a little while ago that with such a vast change of auditors required in that 2021-2022 year because of the independence changes, there was, I think, a natural expectation to go, auditors are going to need to get a much bigger body of evidence to support that first-time audit that they would be doing. And in many instances whereby the audit process where they can't be satisfied because of documentation or questions that may be unresolved, that it is going to naturally see an increase there. The challenge is going to be, well, is that a continued increase that's going to happen year upon year, or will we actually see the dust settle because we now have new auditors in play in respect to certain jobs, and that level of comfort would hopefully continue and improve over the following years.
And the other kind of issue that the ATO's mentioned as well is just with following some of these hacks and data breaches, the APRA funds have been putting on encouraging APRA regulated super funds to adopt tougher checks, which means that there may be some delays with rollovers to SMSFs because obviously they're requiring more ID checks and things like that.
Yeah, so this is something that I had a panel discussion at the SMSF Advisor Technical Strategy Days, and there is ongoing discussion that is happening with APRA-regulated funds and the SMSF Association and a number of administrators to try and standardise processes, because there is on the requirement or on the request to transfer money from an APRA-regulated fund into an SMSF, there is, of course, our SuperStream rules, but APRA funds also have know your client obligations. And there's a really big inconsistency within the current operation of SuperStream around the way in which they're requesting information. So how they need to verify the individuals, and whether some are accepting it in an electronic form, some have to have that sent in by paper. There is a real disconnect, I guess, in how that approach is, which is leading to some significant frustrations. Now, clearly there is an opportunity, or that clearly there is a reason why APRA funds want to ensure that they're passing the money to the right people. But getting that consistency is and should be a high priority for the industry. But again, it comes back to setting expectations with your clients and making sure all the information that you have to start to transact is up to date to try and make that whole process as seamless as possible.
Yeah, hopefully there is some sort of standardization there to make it easier for everyone to know what to expect. The other big topic at the moment is still director IDs, especially with that deadline getting so close now. And there's still a few sort of elements where there's some confusion as well.
Yeah, so we're less than a month out now, and director IDs, funnily enough, we're now seeing the government start to put some advertising dollars towards it and making people aware of it. Find it bizarre that we're doing it now rather than 6 months ago, given that we've had a year of transition. So people wonder why everything gets left to the last minute when the government in their approach, seems to have done the same thing. But if we talk about this in the context of SMSFs, again, the Assistant Commissioner Justin McHale referenced that the view is that around half of SMSF directors are yet to apply. So this is a fairly significant awareness issue. There are a number of practical challenges that happen within the SMSF industry with this. If we think about the number of self-funded retirees and pensioners, not necessarily as technically savvy, and in that application process, most people are kind of left to their own devices because you've got to go through a MyGov ID process and then go through the application process as well to obtain that director ID. And I've seen examples where, applying for the director ID, you actually, to produce the two pieces of identification or information to obtain that director ID, they simply don't have the information available. So yes, you can give them a super fund number, but if they haven't lodged a tax return for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and they might have all of their wealth inside a self-managed super fund, there's no other data that is being pushed through to the ATO that would identify. They're not lodging tax returns. So all those other identity checks that need to verify, they're unable to do so. And it's at that point that you then need to get to the ATO, and, things can just become that little bit too hard. You've heard stories of the skeptics out there that kind of, the tinfoil hat ones, that they don't believe that they're actually going to get director IDs. And then we have had some of the inconsistencies in messaging around people that have died, obviously, in this transitional period. So prior to the introduction of these measures, dealing with incapacity, and a range of these where, in essence, we would have liked to have seen some type of carve out, but quite clearly that's not going to be the case. Of course, if you're dead, they've made clear that you don't have to kind of do a weekend at Bernie's and get them to sign a page. But, there are things in there that haven't been very clear in this process. And we're only getting this clarification now. And here we are less than a month away. So I think if they had their time again, they would probably do a much better job in terms of the distribution of the information. And therefore, the outcomes would have been probably much better in the way and the take-up of people having done it. But it doesn't absolve people that they need to get these direct IDs and get them done by the 30th of November.
Yeah, hopefully everyone gets a move on and that gets sorted.
Yeah.
So that's all the main things from the last 2 weeks. But of course, we've also had the budget, which we're going to be talking about next.
Yeah, so Miranda, the budget was an interesting one, wasn't it? Because it was what I'd call super silent. So there was a lot of discussion about what may be or may not be. And of course, we've got a fairly big hole in the budget that the government is looking to fill. But ultimately, when it came to superannuation, we didn't see very much at all. And there was probably more in what we didn't see than what we did see. So maybe if I can hand over to you and you can go through some of the things that we did actually see in the federal budget.
Yes, it was definitely a quieter year, as you said, but we did finally get some confirmation from the new government on their plans with the residency changes. So they did say they're going to defer those changes, but they did say that they're going to proceed with them, which is a positive news. And there has been some talk as well that they weren't entirely clear about the active member test aspect. Obviously, they're going to proceed with the control central control and management part of the policy. But yeah, there's a little bit of uncertainty still around that other part at this stage.
Yeah, so we saw in the 2021-2022 budget, those two specific measures that related to SMSFs, and this one with the residency changes were in two parts. So they were the change to the safe harbour provisions for the central management and control to move from what is currently 2 years out to a 5-year period. And as you rightly said, they looked at that, or they kind of talked to that issue in the budget papers. The other issue was the removal of the active member test. So really trying to put SMSFs on a level playing field with APRA-regulated funds so that it would allow for contributions to be able to feed into the SMSF, even though the member may be overseas. And as you rightly said, there'd been just a little bit of commentary within the industry just to say, well, this is what the budget change was previously. However, they haven't specifically referenced both of those items. So are they going to break those two items and the nexus of those two items, or are they going to, in essence, continue as was previously announced in 2021, 2022? The thing that we did get out of this is twofold. So one, that we were expected to see this law start from the 1st of July 2022. So the government said that's not going to happen. We have a deferral on that. But I think the good thing is we've got some form of commitment that we are going to see change. When that happens, we just need to wait and see.
Yeah. And they've also just confirmed the downsizer contribution reduction in age from 60 to 55. Obviously, we knew they were already going to proceed with that, and it's working its way through the Senate at the moment, the bill for that change. But yes, that might get passed in the next month or so.
Yeah, so again, there was nothing new here, was there? This has been something that kind of, once Labor got elected, they got the ball rolling on this fairly quickly. It was a fairly straightforward change. So it's somewhat surprising that it was in their budget papers, but in essence, just confirming again that the qualifying age is going from 60 to 55, and the law will start on the first day after the end of the quarter in which that law receives royal assent, or that bill receives royal assent. So if it is finished before the 31st of December this year, then it would take effect from the 1st of January. If nothing gets resolved by the end of this calendar year, then the earliest it would take effect will be the 1st of April next year.
Yeah, and we also saw them rule out the 3-year audit rule, which I'm sure is something most people were very happy about. It was kind of sort of assumed nothing was ever going to happen with this anyway, but I think people are still pleased to have that certainty that that's definitely ruled out.
Yeah, to me, again, this is a good example of, if the government's going to be making announcements, what you want to see is either a confirmation that it is proceeding or a confirmation that it's not. And this was obviously quite controversial when it came out, had a number of complexities, and I guess was challenged around the integrity of what the audit process does. And ultimately, it was seen that, that 3-year process really didn't have the legs to continue beyond that. But until the government comes out and says this is dead in the water, there's always that inference, well, couldn't they actually do this? So similar to the residency stuff that we spoke about, what that tells me here is, in the residency sense, is there's a commitment to it. Whereas in this instance, what we now know is there is no commitment to this going forward, which would give auditors a great deal of relief.
The other thing that they included as well was there's going to be a penalty hike for SMSFs, so where they have a breach. So that's going to go from $222 up to $275 from January next year.
Yeah, so again, this is something that we progressively see the admin penalties grow on, and that impacts things like failure to lodge penalties, but also in the SMSF context, it impacts the administrative penalties. So from the 1st of January, what we're going to see is, if we take, say, a Section 65 breach around lending to members, that 60 penalty units is now going to increase from a $13,200 payment up to $16,500. And how that therefore applies is then dictated by individuals versus a corporate trustee. But the other thing to note there is that indexation of that occurs in line with the actual schedule that is set out within the regulations. And the schedule, that next schedule of indexation is the 1st of July 2023. So it'll be interesting to see whether we have another increase that happens 6 months later or whether there's some sort of recalibration of that. So because 222 to 275 is a reasonable jump, and then we potentially will see a further increase in line with CPI. And we know the rate that CPI is obviously plugging away at the moment.
Yes, exactly. There's also been a lot of talk about this. While it's not really directly related to SMSF, there's been a lot of discussion about this off-market share buybacks changes and franking credits. The SMSF association's come out in the last sort of week or so and sort of said that it doesn't really support these changes and that they are going to have an impact on some SMSF investors.
I think it's fair to say that it's going to play a definite role because it's really trying to understand the basis for what this legislation is intending on doing. So what the law is trying to do is to say, and we did see a number of these buybacks occur this way in the last 12 months. So the institution, the company institution, whatever it is, will go through and raise money. And then through that capital raising process, they are in essence then pushing that money back out to shareholders through a share buyback arrangement. Now, the way in which the share buyback works is that there is a heavy weighting towards a fully franked dividend. And because of the benefit of superannuation, in particular pension phase, there is the franking credit that then loads itself up and can be collected as part of the annual return. So what they're looking at doing is to try and deny the funds the ability to claim that franking credit where there is an arrangement whereby that money that is being raised is then being used to funnel that money back out again. So that concept of the off-market share buyback schemes certainly potentially puts a nail in the coffin in some respects, because to be able to pay out money in many instances, if you think of a listed entity, they're going to need the cash flow to do it. So they're going to have to be balancing out here. Do we need the money to be investing back into the business, into a whole range of things, or do we need to be paying money out to shareholders? So these type of off-market buybacks, the way in which they could raise money to then do that distribution was obviously quite successful over long periods of time. Not only superannuation funds, charities and the like also benefit from this. And therefore, yes, self-managed super funds are going to be impacted by that decision, but it will be interesting to see how companies would respond if this legislation does see light of day.
Yeah, I think people are quite upset about the retrospectivity of it as well.
Yeah, and I think that would be a fairly long bow to draw to try and go back and target, therefore, funds that were entitled to significant franking credits over the last few years and then say, actually, no, you're not entitled to that. Please pay us, 10, 15, 20, hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially in many instances. I think if they, a practical outcome would be if they did get this over the line, that it would have a 1 July start date, for example, or it would take effect from the date in which it received royal assent. So there was no retrospectivity to that. And we know how successful retrospectivity has been over the last few years. Usually gets slammed down pretty hard and then they have to recalibrate accordingly.
And the other thing that was mentioned was just around extra funding for modernising the business registers. So that includes them merging those 30 business registers together and just funding the director ID regime as well.
Is that to chase up all those that haven't got their director IDs, Miranda, do you think?
It could well be.
So I think, again, there'd been some concerns about the timeframes of the project and the amount that was required to invest in this. So, it doesn't surprise me that they've got to continue to throw a bit of money at that point in time. So, Miranda, that was pretty much it there in respect to what did happen and what impacted superannuation and SMSFs. The other thing, I guess, that is probably more interesting was what wasn't announced. So let's have a bit of a discussion around that.
Yes, so there was obviously a lot of talk in the lead up to the budget about what they might do. One of the things that quite a few people sort of suggested was this idea of them freezing the general transfer balance cap, particularly with it, it might even go up to 1.9. Obviously, that means a lot more tax-free money. So we could see them perhaps freeze that indexation at some point. It's still a possibility for the May budget, potentially.
Yeah, so you're right. So even though we get the confirmation of whether that will be 1.8 or 1.9 by the end of January, there is still a position that the government could take to put a freeze on that, because we will have, in essence, a real budget for 2023-24. Can't believe I'm saying that figure already. But, in that May budget that could then, again, just keep that number at 1.7. And, of course, that not only impacts the amount of money that can be in retirement phase, it also impacts the ability to make contributions into superannuation as well.
Yes, I guess it flows on to other things, so it would have a big impact.
Yep.
And there's also been a lot of discussion about this $5 million cap for super, which does have a lot of support from various parts of the super industry. And we have heard sort of Stephen Jones say that he's quite open to this idea. So it'll be interesting to see if that maybe makes an appearance in the next budget.
Yeah, and again, this goes back to discussions around adequacy and the super tax concessions, and this really followed some of the information contained within the Retirement Income Review final report. And, what is that number? And I guess you can kind of magically pick a number out. Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? Is it 3 million? And then the methodology that would need to occur around it. So there's a fair bit of work in it. If we go back to the introduction of the transfer balance cap, I mean, back at that point in time when we had a federal election, then Labor did propose then a different approach to dealing with balances. And it was, from memory, it was around a $1.5 million threshold, but it was an earnings threshold. So in essence, you got concessional treatment on the first $75,000, and then you had to pay 15% tax there. So are we going to get into that type of thing on top of the transfer balance cap, or are they going to mandate the removal of assets out of the superannuation system? And if there's going to be that, then there's going to be some fairly significant challenges in the removal, because obviously we just can't have people selling down assets at the drop of a hat. Is there going to have to be some 10-year transitional period to allow for them to be able to do that? There's a lot of water that would need to go under the bridge. But I think on the, if you kind of call it the pub test, which I know previously there'd been a lot of talk about that as I guess, in some context with this issue, to say, well, someone that is on the full age pension is not getting the same level of tax concession that someone that might have $5 and $10 million that are picking up large tax refunds. And there's always a focus around when the ATO released data, funds that are over $100 million. There are equally funds, members that have very significant balances within APRA-regulated funds. So should they be getting the same level of tax concessions that they're getting today when we think about the current economic conditions? So it seems like an easy target. And generally speaking, from that pub test point of view, I don't think you get many people that would go, actually, that's unfair.
Yeah, I can't imagine them having too much sympathy for people with $5 million. But as you said, it does make things more complex, and advisors have to deal with potentially getting large lumpy assets out of a fund, which is really difficult.
Yeah, and even the government has indicated that they're throwing more resources towards the ATO as well. So we're already seeing fairly scrutinised large balances around their compliance and making sure that they're paying the right level of taxes and all this sort of stuff, and they're going to be scrutinised even further. But this is a fairly substantial policy change about trying to get the settings and balance right within superannuation. So I'm in the court where I think, yes, we would likely see something deal with this issue, because it's been raised from the Retirement Income Review. And that whole piece, when we think about baby boomers, is certainly front and centre as we move forward with superannuation, in addition to obviously the contribution increases that we're seeing with SG as well.
Yeah, and the other big thing that everyone was looking for in the budget, or at least expecting something to be in there, was around the fix for or an approach to what they're going to do with non-arm's length income and expenditure. But there was it was silent on that.
Yeah, this was very surprising, I must admit, because we'd already seen some form of recognition from the previous government. Senator Jane Hume had indicated that they'd listened and they would go and look at a rewrite of the law to deal with the way in which the operation of the non-arm's length expenditure rules apply within the NALI provisions, where the expenditure incurred or not incurred, generally connects to all the fund's income. So this kind of expectation that at least to say that they're there to reiterate the previous government's announcement and that they would look to change. When we think about, the audit stuff that was in there around the 3 audits, there was something in there that says we're no longer committed to this. It was a glaring omission. And we do have our ATO's practical compliance relief only until 30 June next year. And now, of course, they could expand on that again. But, we would like to see the government come forward with some sort of commitment to the change. There is large consensus within the industry around the issue. It's not just an SMSF issue, it's an APRA land issue as well. So, it was a glaring omission in my view as well.
And the other thing that it was silent on was the legacy pension amnesty as well. There was nothing on that.
Yeah, so this again goes back, I spoke earlier on in today's session around the fact that the former government had 2 key announcements that never saw light of day. So we talked about the residency rules before, and yes, there was a 1 July 2022 introduction of that measure that they've just put a deferral on it. But when we saw that, why didn't we see anything around the other issue, which was around these legacy pension conversions? So we had a 2-year amnesty period where in essence it would allow funds to unwind those legacy pensions. So we talk about market-linked pensions and defined benefit income streams. So at this stage, we have no certainty as to whether Labor's committed to allowing for this to occur or not. And again, it would have been an opportune time for them to go either we're not proceeding or we are proceeding, rather than leaving everyone in limbo.
Yeah, it seems like it's dropped off their radar now, and that it might be better sort of addressing these funds in a different way rather than waiting for the amnesty if it's sort of a more urgent situation.
Yeah. I mean, the only final other thing that I can think here, Miranda, that is relevant is really around these stage 3 tax cuts. And there's a bit of discussion around, will they proceed, won't they proceed? I think if I'm a betting man, given that we are in Cup Week here, is that what we will likely see is if they do decide to proceed with these tax cuts, will we see the adjustment come on the other side? And what I mean by that is will we see maybe a reduction in Div 293? So whilst they're giving the money one way in the tax cuts, will they actually claw it back through an additional tax through Division 293, where they might reduce that threshold down from 250 to say 200,000, which they previously committed to doing? Or could they even drop that down to the top tier at $180,000? So whilst they might be giving it out in one hand, they might be taking a fair bit back in the other hand. And I think we might see some connection there if, again, they do decide to proceed with those stage 3 tax cuts.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't rule out a reduction in the Div 293, as it was something they sort of floated before, and they haven't really ruled that one out either.
So I think what this all leads to, Miranda, is the May 2023 budget's probably going to have a lot more in it that's going to impact superannuation. And, talking to many of my peers in the industry, it was one of those nights where you wonder whether you're going to go to bed at 9 o'clock or 4 a.m. So this certainly amounted to a 9 o'clock one. It was over and done pretty quickly. But I don't think we'll be saying the same thing when we're talking about this topic. It might need to be an extended version or over a few SMSF advisor shows, because, I do think we're primed to see some change within the superannuation laws off the back of, obviously the current economic landscape.
Yeah, I definitely think next May is going to be the bigger one.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, everyone. As is always the way, Miranda, if people want to hear more about topics, speakers and suggestions for topics, how can they get in contact with us?
So they can get in touch at editor@smsfadvisoronline.com.au.
Well, thank you, everyone, for once again joining us on the SMSF Advisor Show. We look forward to you joining us for our next episode in a fortnight's time. Take care and bye for now.
Interest rates are rising fast, and that means higher mortgage repayments. But some lenders have increased their rates more than others, so that could mean your clients are now paying too much for their loan. We can quickly compare your client's rate with hundreds of similar loans, so you are confident that you've got the best rate on the market, or we'll find you a better rate. Make sure your clients aren't paying the highest interest rates. Call Finny today. Visit finny.com.au and let us take the research and admin out of finding a new rate for your clients.